The year is 1944. The month is December. The location is the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The time is just before dawn, and the air is bitter, heavy with the scent of pine and frozen mud. The date is a seemingly ordinary Tuesday, yet it will be inscribed in history as the beginning of Hitler's last, desperate, massive gamble. The deep silence of the pre-dawn forest was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a cocked spring, ready to release unimaginable violence. For weeks, the Allied advance across France and into the Low Countries had seemed unstoppable. The German Wehrmacht was perceived as beaten, its divisions broken, its logistics failing, its armies retreating toward the Rhine. The general consensus among Allied leadership was that the war in Europe would be over by Christmas. This pervasive sense of complacency was precisely the psychological and strategic void the Führer planned to exploit. The full scope of the initial shock and panic that followed the German breakthrough on December 16th was fueled by something far more insidious than the conventional might of Tiger tanks and SS divisions. Infiltrators. These were not merely spies in the traditional sense, operating as lone agents in civilian clothes. They were an army of shadows, a highly specialized commando unit designed for maximum strategic disruption. Operation Greif, Operation Griffin, was conceived by Adolf Hitler himself. Its goal was not just reconnaissance, but the immediate, targeted sabotage of the American rear echelon infrastructure. The mission was entrusted to one of the Third Reich's most unconventional, effective and dangerous soldiers, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny, the man who had famously rescued Benito Mussolini, was tasked with organizing Panzer Brigade 150. The core of this brigade was an elite unit of commandos, fluent in American English, dressed in stolen, meticulously sourced American uniforms, driving captured American jeeps, and even some cunningly disguised German vehicles. Their objective was audacious in its simplicity: to penetrate the lines during the initial chaos, sow systemic panic, disrupt communications, change crucial road signs, spread deliberate disinformation, and most critically, seize the vital bridges over the Meuse River, thereby paralyzing the entire Allied response. The irony was devastating to the American morale. The soldiers, fighting their way through the worst European winter in a decade, had mentally prepared for every conceivable conventional threat: tanks, artillery barrages, snipers in the dense woods. They had not prepared for the enemy to look, sound and smell exactly like them. The uniform, typically the symbol of camaraderie and trust, was weaponized against them. The Americans rely on order, on communications, on a clear chain of command. We would destroy that order, not with shells but with confusion. Their own uniforms would be the key to their paralysis. The technical and operational preparation for Operation Greif was meticulous, bordering on obsessive. Panzer Brigade 150 was equipped with captured M3 half-tracks and even 5 Panther tanks, painstakingly modified and painted to resemble American M10 tank destroyers. Every detail of the Ghost Marines was vetted, from the American-made cigarettes, Lucky Strike Camel, to the correct field rations, K rations, and the specific slang and jargon used by American soldiers in the European Theatre of Operations, ETO. The soldiers selected for this task were the very best German intelligence could offer. Many had lived in America before the war, working as engineers, businessmen, or students. Others were former members of the Kriegsmarine, who had spent time on merchant vessels docking in U.S. ports. They possessed not just the linguistic fluency, but an understanding of American mannerisms, the way they held their cigarettes, the way they complained about military food, the unique cadence of their dialogue. On the morning of December 16, 1944, as the main German offensive, the sheer weight of 5 armies slammed into the thin, inexperienced American lines, the Ghost Marines slipped through the cracks. They arrived not with the roar of combat, but with the quiet, devastating creep of systemic sabotage. Wires were cut with surgical precision. Military police checkpoints in the rear were given precisely wrong orders, citing non-existent secret commands. Most chillingly, road signs pointing toward Allied fuel dumps, supply depots, and critical headquarters were reversed or removed entirely. The chaos that ensued was instantaneous and multiplied rapidly. American columns, urgently needed at the front, were sent down dead-end roads or worse, straight into the advancing German spearheads. Rear echelon commanders, relying on radio and field telephones, found their communications networks unreliable, their orders contradicted, and their intelligence feeds poisoned by disinformation. A sense of deep, corrosive paranoia began to settle over the entire American sector, replacing battlefield fear with psychological terror. Every passing jeep became a suspect. Every shared cigarette, every casual conversation about a general's competence held the potential for death and betrayal. The vital fundamental trust that holds an army together dissolved into a gnawing constant suspicion. The question quickly shifted from "where is the enemy?" to the terrifying realization of "who amongst us isn't the enemy?" The very fabric of Allied control was fraying. This documentary will explore the central contradiction of this terrifying and technically brilliant operation. How did a highly trained, technologically prepared elite unit of saboteurs, recruited from the sharpest minds of German military intelligence, fail to understand the simple yet profound essence of the American identity? The key to their undoing, the detail that the highly pragmatic and efficient German planners overlooked, was found in a few simple words. Words that no German spy, however well briefed, could ever truly master, because they were drawn from the deep well of American cultural history and passion. If you're finding this deep dive into WW2 espionage, cultural warfare, and the strange ingenuity of military history compelling, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapters on the rapid spread of panic and the simple cultural question that unmasked Scorzini's Ghost Marines. The first 48 hours of the Ardennes offensive were a masterclass in psychological warfare executed by Operation Greif. The initial successes were devastating and immediate. The German main attack achieved complete surprise, but the Einsatzgruppen, the German infiltration teams, turned that military surprise into a complete command meltdown. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest formation of American troops ever assembled, and his entire staff were temporarily confined to their headquarters in Luxembourg. The security risk was considered too high, fueled by credible intelligence reports, that Scorzini's main personal mission was to assassinate or kidnap him or the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This single threat, whether real or a masterful piece of disinformation, froze the top tier of American command at a moment of supreme crisis. The sheer volume of false information spewed by the infiltrators was crippling the Allied counterattack before it could even be organized. German saboteurs posing as American military police MPs successfully rerouted entire infantry divisions toward concentrated enemy fire or simply sent them into long, exhausting and pointless loops down obscure Belgian backroads, wasting precious fuel and time. The American supply lines, the industrial lifeblood of the entire war effort, were not just attacked, they were convulsing with confusion. We were running on fumes and rumors. A corporal would tell you the road ahead was clear, then 10 minutes later, a lieutenant would stop you and say the corporal was a kraut and the road was mined. You couldn't trust your own shadow. You didn't dare talk about anything important because you couldn't be sure who was listening or who you were talking to. The technical difficulty for the Americans lay in the extraordinary level of detail in the German deception. The spies possessed the correct uniforms, perfectly tailored and weathered. They had the right insignia, from the small divisional patches to the specific rank markings. They carried genuine dog tags, some stolen, some cleverly forged. They even mastered the minutiae of the American soldiers' field equipment, from the smell of American gunpowder to the specific brand of chewing tobacco favored by the GIs. Their English was functional, sometimes flawless, incorporating the popular slang of the time, snafu, Roger, Jeep, G.I. Joe, and the essential four-letter words that peppered the dialogue of the fighting man. The crisis demanded a simple, fast and definitive method of identification. A standard interrogation focused on military knowledge could easily be foiled by a German intelligence officer who had meticulously studied the captured field manuals, ranks, and unit designations. What the German spies could not fake, what they could not acquire from a captured textbook, was the cultural DNA of an American fighting man. The search for this cultural fingerprint led the military police, under enormous pressure from the rear echelons, to craft a counter-strategy. This solution was not born in a sanitized briefing room or in a high-command strategy session. It emerged from the desperate necessity of the moment, from the need to quickly and definitively filter friend from foe on a dark, snow-dusted road in the middle of the night. The solution required questions that were not merely facts, but trivia that mattered to the soul of the American citizen soldier. They started with basic textbook cultural touchstones: American history, geography, names of famous political figures. But these were quickly realized to be too easy to memorize. Scorzeni's men were prepared for the superficial. They knew the name of President Roosevelt and the capital of New York. The breakthrough came from an unlikely and chaotic source: a small, beleaguered unit of the 82nd Airborne Division, holding a crucial crossroads near the town of Stavelot. A frustrated corporal, Private First Class John R. Fox, recounts in his later debriefings how after a close encounter with a suspiciously well-informed MP, who nonetheless seemed hesitant about common American gestures, he proposed testing knowledge that required true, genuine immersion, not just rote memorization. He proposed questions about America's true national religion, sports, specifically baseball and American football. The technical requirements of the test were simple, yet brilliant in their specificity. They needed questions like: who played in the last World Series? What is the batting average of Joe DiMaggio? Which famous boxer just retired? And the ultimate litmus test, the one that quickly became the stuff of legend, the question that encapsulated the shared military experience, the football question. This was the genesis of the gridiron gambit. It was a spontaneous, decentralized piece of tactical genius born from the American spirit. The core strategy behind the gridiron gambit was pure psychological brilliance. Ask the suspect a question so intrinsically cultural that only genuine, long-term, intuitive exposure to American life could possibly provide the immediate, unhesitating answer. It had to be low-level common knowledge to a civilian, yet deemed strategically pointless to the average German intelligence briefing, focused as they were on tactical and operational details. The perfect question, refined through rapid trial and error across dozens of checkpoints, was deceptively simple. It tapped into the massive shared media landscape of 1940s America. Questions like, who is dating Betty Grable? Or, what is the nickname of the Notre Dame football team? The American soldiers intuitively understood that while a German spy could memorize the name of the president or the capital of a state, they could not fake the emotional and intuitive connection to the intricacies of American popular culture, especially baseball and college football, which dominated the newspaper headlines back home. The pragmatic, systematic German mind, trained for efficiency and military fact, would naturally dismiss this information as strategically irrelevant noise. One specific football-related question quickly became the ultimate definitive security check across the entire American front lines in the Ardennes. Who won the Army-Navy football game last year, and by what score? This required not just knowing the teams, which might be an expected answer in a military context, but the granular detail of the score, the specific circumstances, and the emotional resonance of the most important rivalry in the entire American military ethos. This game, played just a few weeks prior in Philadelphia, was the pinnacle of service pride. Every soldier, sailor, and Marine had read about it, listened to it on the Armed Forces radio, or at least heard the results debated endlessly. A true GI either knew the answer instantly, or at least knew why the question was existentially important to ask. A German spy, even one who spoke flawless English, would almost certainly hesitate, or worse, provide a factually incorrect answer from a previous year. They asked about the cinema stars. I knew Clark Gable. They asked about a sport, a ball game. I knew the rules for baseball, the teams. But the score? The scores are always changing. Why would I memorize a score? The American soldier, he cared about these things more than the names of his commanders or the models of his machine guns. The technical moment of truth on the roads was a micro-drama played out thousands of times. A stolen jeep approaches a newly established U.S. Army checkpoint, typically manned by a small, nervous group of MPs or rear echelon engineers. The air is thick with cold and suspicion. The American driver is dressed perfectly, smoking a familiar brand of cigarette. His accent is passable. The American MP steps forward, his M1 Garand rifle trained directly on the driver. He asks the standard, predictable questions: unit designation, destination, the day's official password. The spy, having memorized his briefing, answers flawlessly. Then comes the gambit. MP, calmly but with a hard edge. "All right, Corporal, just one more for the road. Who won the Army-Navy game last year and what was the final score, and don't think about it?" The response separated life from death. The true American might roll his eyes at the simple security, grumble about the score, or confidently shout out the detail. The German spy had a millisecond to process a piece of trivia that did not exist on any of his mission parameters. The slightest hesitation, a stutter, the wrong nickname, the wrong team, or critically the wrong score, which was often close, increasing the difficulty, and the MP was on him. The terror inflicted on the German side was purely psychological. The knowledge that they could be exposed, not by their accent or a faulty uniform, but by a missing piece of cultural fluff, undermined their entire sense of preparedness. They became vulnerable not to conventional military force, but to the simple, unexpected power of a sports statistic. The stakes were absolute. The efficiency of the German commandos was their weakness. They could mimic the hardware, but not the human software. The gridiron gambit proved that the war was not just fought on the battlefield, but in the realm of shared experience and national identity. The implementation of cultural trivia, the gridiron gambit, had an immediate and profoundly disruptive effect on Operation Greif. It was the simple, brilliant counter-tactic necessary to cut through the paralyzing fog of paranoia that had gripped the American rear. Within 72 hours of the first infiltrators being captured and interrogated, the use of these pop culture filters spread from the 82nd Airborne Sector to divisions across the entire front line. Military police were issued not only the list of official passwords, but a rotating list of cultural questions, focusing on baseball, football, popular movie stars, and even comic strip characters. The first definitive catches under this new protocol were stark and dramatic. One of the most famous occurred when a German spy, questioned about the capital of an American state, correctly answered, but then, under intense pressure, identified the then Vice President of the United States as Henry Wallace. Wallace had been replaced by Harry S. Truman months earlier at the Democratic National Convention. A minor political fact, crucial in the context of deep American political awareness, was the spy's instantaneous and fatal undoing. But the sports questions, particularly those about football, proved to be the most decisive engine of capture. We didn't need to break them with lights and pain. We broke them with confusion over a silly football game. They knew the M1 Garand rifle inside and out. They knew the firing tables for the artillery. But they would stall on, what's the best baseball team in New York? It showed a gap in their world that couldn't be filled by a textbook or 6 weeks of immersion training. They had the language, but they lacked the soul. The interrogation of the captured spies revealed the astonishing extent of their failure to comprehend the American cultural psyche. Skorzny's men had been trained to mimic the movements, the speech patterns, and the technical knowledge of American soldiers, but they had not been trained to feel or think like them. They knew the tools of war, but not the idiosyncrasies of peace that defined the men who used them. The lack of cultural context made simple questions impossible to answer under duress. The most severe penalty for a captured German infiltrator dressed in an American uniform was execution by firing squad for espionage and violating the rules of war. This harsh, unyielding reality added a layer of profound psychological terror for both sides. The American soldier, now forced to play a deadly game of trivia, knew the stakes were absolute. The German spy knew that a moment of confusion over a football score, a movie star's relationship, or a comic strip character could lead directly to the execution wall. The total number of Skorzny's men who successfully infiltrated the lines was, perhaps surprisingly, small, around 44 in the initial wave, with fewer successfully reaching their primary objectives. However, their strategic impact was massive. The sheer panic and resource diversion they caused forced the Allied High Command to divert thousands of troops to rear security, road checks and internal investigations, effectively slowing critical reinforcements to the front lines during the most desperate freezing days of the German offensive. The infiltrators failed in their objective to seize the Meuse bridges, but they succeeded in their secondary goal of sowing chaos. The ultimate irony of Operation Greif was that its effectiveness lay entirely in its complete secrecy. Once the first saboteurs were caught, and the Americans discovered the common thread of their exposure, cultural ignorance, the entire operation began to crumble. The news that Americans were using pop culture trivia to filter spies spread like wildfire among the Allied troops, instantly neutralizing the advantage of the disguise. The psychological edge, the ability to sow undetectable, paralyzing chaos, was lost forever. The German High Command had failed to account for a factor more powerful than logistics or firepower, the resilience of a shared cultural identity. The realization that their perfectly costumed agents were being betrayed by something as simple as the score of a football game was a massive blow to the morale and confidence of the intelligence apparatus. The tide of the battle and the war itself was about to turn, but first, the American forces had to decisively deal with the remnants of the ghost army they had just unmasked. The paranoia was receding, replaced by a cold, hard determination fueled by a surprising source, the familiar comfort of American cultural life. The Battle of the Bulge officially concluded with a decisive German defeat. Hitler's massive offensive, his last desperate industrial-scale gamble, had failed. The failure was primarily due to the ferocious American resistance, the strategic tenacity of leaders like Patton, and the crucial intervention of air support once the brutal winter clouds finally broke. However, in a small yet vital chapter of the battle's history, the defeat was also hastened by the clever, spontaneous, and distinctly American use of cultural counter-espionage. The psychological impact of the infiltrators lingered long after the battle lines stabilized. For the remainder of the war in Europe, American soldiers maintained a significantly higher degree of suspicion and required more stringent identification procedures. The lesson learned was profound. Identity is more than uniform. It is a deep, internalized tapestry of language, habit, and cultural knowledge that cannot be faked through weeks of intensive study. Scorzeni's men, for all their specialized training and willingness to face certain death, were ultimately victims of a fundamental strategic oversight. They prepared exhaustively for the military enemy, but not for the human one. They understood the technical specifications of the M1 rifle, the radio codes, and the rank structure, but they fundamentally failed to grasp the importance of a sports rivalry, a Hollywood gossip item, or a comic strip to the men who carried that rifle. Operation Greif stands as a perfect, almost ironic example of strategic failure through cultural blindness. The German planners focused with meticulous precision on the hardware, the uniforms, the vehicle markings, the mechanical translation of the language. The Americans, in desperation, discovered that the soft spot was the soul, the shared trivia, the common heroes, the simple, seemingly pointless passions that define the collective unconscious of a nation. The spies were betrayed by what they failed to value. The memory of the gridiron gambit survived as a cherished piece of soldier folklore. The simple question about the Army-Navy score became more than a temporary security measure. It became a defining, often darkly humorous narrative of the entire battle. It was a victory not just of superior firepower, but of ingenuity and cultural connection, a crucial reminder that in the shadow of the greatest industrial war in history, the small, seemingly irrelevant details of human life mattered most. The execution of captured spies was a grim necessity, but their failure provided a crucial counter-narrative for the American forces. The success of the gambit served as a significant morale boost, a collective joke that broke the paralyzing tension of the initial chaos. It reaffirmed the soldiers' sense of shared identity and their connection to the home front. They were American, and the things they cared about, like the final score of the biggest college football game of the year, were things the Germans could never truly understand or replicate. This cultural firewall proved to be as effective as any defensive line. The ultimate dismantling of Panzer Brigade 150 demonstrated the limit of technical espionage. While the Germans could perfectly counterfeit the American uniform, they could not counterfeit the American experience. They could speak the words, but they could not feel the collective pride, the shared memories, and the emotional investment that defined the men they sought to betray. The Ghost Marines were finally exposed, not by a barrage of shells or the deployment of a new secret weapon, but by a simple, universally shared, and uniquely American question. And in that moment of unmasking, the tide of fear was finally turned. The cultural distance proved to be the final fatal gap the German spies could not bridge. This story is one of countless hidden, culturally specific chapters from the Second World War. If you want to see more meticulously researched, dramatic and historically accurate documentaries like this, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We dive deep into the strategic, technological, and deeply human stories that define history. Let us know in the comments below what other seemingly trivial cultural fact could have unmasked the German spies. The failure of Operation Greif to sustain its deception speaks to a profound misunderstanding of cultural difference by German intelligence. Their methodology was based on linguistic and functional mimicry, a belief that by mastering the surface elements, the slang, the insignia, the procedures, they could seamlessly integrate. What they missed was the crucial element of shared context. The German intelligence community, often efficient and detail-oriented in military logistics, viewed American popular culture as frivolous, as noise. They prioritized the essential facts: troop movements, weapon specifications, command structure. The American soldier, however, was fundamentally a citizen soldier, deeply connected to a massive, vibrant, and largely non-military media landscape. The true American GI could be defined as much by his knowledge of the New York Yankees as by his proficiency with the M1 Garand. This cultural chasm became the focus of intense post-battle analysis on both sides. For the Germans, it was a painful lesson in the limitations of pure technical intelligence. They had effectively trained their men to pass a military exam, but not a cultural citizenship test. We had assumed that under the conditions of total war, the American soldier would shed his civilian interests. We were wrong. He carried his civilian life, his baseball, his movie stars, as a form of protective armor, a constant reminder of what he was fighting for, not just what he was fighting against. The questions themselves were designed to expose a lack of intuitive knowledge. A German infiltrator might memorize the 1944 World Series winner, the St. Louis Cardinals. But an MP could then follow up with a question designed to test contextual knowledge. What did the sports writers call the Cardinals' star pitcher that year? This level of detailed, shifting, vernacular knowledge was impossible to replicate without genuine experience. The spy would hesitate, searching for a memorized fact, whereas the real GI would instinctively recall the nickname. The terror was amplified by the speed of the checks. The checkpoint was a stressful environment. An MP was looking for a reaction that was too slow, too precise, or too literal. A true American might crack a joke about the game, offering a bit of commentary along with the fact. The German spy would simply offer the bare, memorized answer, a technical success that was a psychological failure. The gridiron gambit was also a decentralized intelligence triumph. It was an example of bottom-up innovation winning against top-down planning. The general staff did not invent the football question. A corporal in the mud, tired of paranoia, did. The effectiveness lay in its organic nature, its rapid adoption by soldiers who understood the simple truth. These are the things we share. The scale of the diversion caused by Skorzany's relatively small unit was staggering. Thousands of American troops, including those with critical engineering skills, were tied up on MP duty, guarding supply dumps and chasing rumors for over a week. Fuel rationing became a nightmare. It took weeks for the psychological wound of the infiltrators to fully heal. Ultimately, the failure of the Ghost Marines serves as a potent historical narrative about the human element in conflict. It highlights how a massive industrialized war machine can be temporarily crippled by a few men in the wrong uniforms, and how that deception can be countered by something as small, yet powerful, as a shared memory of a football game. The Germans sought to replace American identity with mimicry. The Americans defended it with trivia. The conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge did not mark the end of the cultural paranoia created by Operation Greif. The experience left an indelible mark on the American military psyche, shaping counterintelligence practices for decades. The lessons learned in the frozen forests of the Ardennes were not about tank tactics or air superiority, but about the fundamental vulnerability of identity in a multinational total war. After the German retreat, the fate of the captured infiltrators became a matter of intense legal and ethical scrutiny. Skorzany's men were captured wearing American uniforms while performing acts of sabotage, a clear violation of the Hague Convention and the rules of land warfare. Those captured in uniform and proven to be actively engaging in espionage or sabotage were tried swiftly by a military tribunal and executed by firing squad. Skorzeny himself managed to evade capture initially, only to surrender later. He was tried at the Dachau Military Tribunal in 1947, specifically for Operation Greif. His defense was simple and audacious. He argued that the rules of war only prohibited fighting in the enemy's uniform. His men had merely worn the uniforms to infiltrate, but intended to fight, if necessary, in German uniforms which they carried underneath. This argument, while morally dubious, exploited a legal ambiguity of the time. Skorzeny was ultimately acquitted of this charge, though he remained imprisoned for other war crimes. The technicality provided a strange, unsatisfying footnote to the entire affair. However, the historical memory of the Ghost Marines remained defined not by legal semantics, but by the psychological warfare they waged and the ingenious method of their exposure. The Gridiron Gambit became a benchmark for security in the field. The true cost of Operation Greif was not measured in fuel or material, but in trust. It taught us that the enemy will always seek the psychological backdoor. The defense is simple: know your men. Know their history, their language, and what makes them tick. The easiest language to fake is military jargon. The hardest is cultural truth. The story has taken on a life of its own in military lore, often exaggerated, but always carrying the central truth. Soldiers from that era would often recount the story of the MP who asked, "Who is Joe DiMaggio married to?" The correct answer, Marilyn Monroe, would not come until after the war, but the question format, using celebrity gossip as a security check, is a perfect encapsulation of the method's genius. It was a fluid, adaptive test that changed constantly, ensuring that any German briefing from a week prior was instantly obsolete. In essence, the Gridiron Gambit was the first true application of pop culture as a tactical security measure. It exposed a universal military truth. Armies are composed of human beings who carry their culture and identity into battle. When that identity is challenged, the simplest, most trivial pieces of shared knowledge become the most powerful weapons in their defense. The German commandos were brilliantly trained, perfectly equipped, and strategically positioned, but in the final assessment, they were undone by the one thing they couldn't study in a captured manual: the score of a football game. The lesson is timeless. In the intricate dance of espionage, you can steal the clothes, but you can never steal the context. If you found this exploration of military espionage and cultural identity compelling, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing and turning on notifications. Let us know in the comments below which part of the cultural counter-espionage you found most fascinating.